Uh, Sir, what is the relevance of research in the context of COVID-19 when we talk about Ayurvedic medicine?
Yeah, I mean, today it's the age of evidence-based medicine. So, in the ultimate, you know, point of view, the world to accept Ayurveda, we need to show that it works. So, if Ayurveda is to help people all over the globe, it will have to go through so many regulatory approvals, and even in India, that is necessary for it to get accepted, as a valid modality of treatment for COVID-19. So, from that point of view, even though in the emergency situation, in the name of having to immediately care for the patient, we can argue for a clinical practice approach based on the guidelines and all that we talked about. But at the ultimate run, if the world is to accept that certain interventions of Ayurveda are useful for COVID-19, then we would really need to back up, with the proper evidence, and especially because COVID-19 is not described in the texts. So we cannot quote textual references as an evidence, as we can do in many other diseases. We can say that, it's been proven for thousands of years. But here we'll have to show two things. One is that Ayurveda can understand COVID-19 from within its theoretical framework, that it is possible. We'll have to demonstrate that. And then we must also be able to demonstrate that the treatments that we have derived from this understanding of Ayurvedic, theory and framework about COVID-19 is also effective, in actual practice.
Sir, when we talk about research, should it be in the direction of developing a vaccine or researching for an antiviral drug as the modern counterparts are doing when it comes to Ayurveda?
Yeah, the Ayurveda and modern medicine give us two different ways of looking at the body. The modeling is different. Modern medicine has a more mechanistic understanding of the system. It has its advantages and its disadvantages. For me, in the long run, we really need to integrate different approaches so that we have a more complete understanding of the human being. This we must keep in mind. So, when we think about research, it does not exactly have to be the same thing that's happening in Western medicine. Really, we have to see how Ayurveda can add, and give another dimension to this whole problem. So the idea of a vaccine is based on a particular understanding of the human body, the mechanistic, modeling of the immune system, what they call as the innate immunity and the adaptive immunity, the ability of the body to develop specific antibodies, against specific viruses. So that kind of modeling is not there in Ayurveda. So, this idea of innate immunity, adaptive immunity, this understanding comes from the modern scientific framework. But we cannot say that such an approach is totally absent in Ayurveda because we have historical records. When the Britishers came to India, this smallpox inoculation was actually in practice here. Even before Edward Jenner discovered vaccination, and there are accounts of great fascination on the success of this inoculation program. This was not there in Europe at that time. So there they would take the pus of people who are infected with smallpox, and then a group of people would go around. It's like a public health initiative, and all the people would be vaccinated. I mean, inoculated. Inoculation and vaccination are slightly different. And then they had to follow some diet, and then they would get a mild episode of the illness, and then they would get immunity. So this idea of inducing immunity through these methods are not totally alien to Ayurveda, but now modern medicine is very specialized in that. And so I don't think we should try to again work in that region. Of course, if there are some clues that can be got from Ayurveda, but the technology that is needed to develop, they're all based on modern scientific developments. And I think we should allow modern researchers and scientists to do what they excel at. So I think that's not our cup of tea. And if you come to antiviral medicines, There are many Ayurvedic herbs which have already been found to be having a potential antiviral activity, but these are mostly the preclinical stages.
Mm,
So, but here there is little bit more scope to think in that way, the antiviral thing. I mean, are there herbs or formulations which contain chemicals which can, interfere with the viral replication in the body
mm,
at various stages, cell entry or inside the cell,
mm,
when it hijacks our, genetic
mm,
material, then it replicates and it comes out of the cell at all these stages. There is a little bit more scope, but this would be an area for integrative research. It's not a pure Ayurvedic research because we will have to convert our knowledge into modern
mm,
scientific terms, into all the phytochemicals and all those things. So it will be partly, it's a kind of a hybrid research
mm,
where this is very much necessary also, I think, because people world over are already looking towards plants, phytopharmaceuticals,
mm,
even not only for viruses but also other antimicrobial resistant organisms, because antimicrobial resistance is becoming a global,
mm,
challenge. So
mm,
there, together we can do it. But the real strength of Ayurveda is in looking at the body in a totally different way, not just as a single
mm,
virus or just
mm,
as one component of the immune system. But how can we bring back that balance to the body at the
mm,
level of not only the physical body, but also the
mm,
mind
mm,
and the
mm,
being as a whole, and make
mm,
them prepared, to overcome these kind of infections and challenges in a very wholesome way. That is where I think Ayurveda has got the greatest strength. So, if we were to think of a pure Ayurvedic approach to research, we should be looking at models which is based on Ayurveda's understanding of Tridosha, Ama, Agni, how these ojas, how these factors can be optimized in an individual. And so
mm,
we may end up in a situation where we are not actually developing a vaccine kind of immunity. We are not having a drug which will totally damage the virus or inactivate it,
mm,
but we will be creating a situation where the body is, optimized to
mm,
actually overcome a viral infection by its own.
mm,
So you have what we could call as a kind of natural immunity. And I
mm,
think that is where Ayurveda has the greatest strength. So that the
mm,
whole recovery from this illness puts you into a higher level of health. So there are no residual problems. So we are completely empowering the person to
mm,
overcome and fight the disease. So I would say that we need both approaches because,
mm,
in a complex society where some people are very vulnerable, some are, much more healthier, we will need a combination of the approaches of modern medicine and Ayurveda. If we just rely on one of them, there will be deficiencies. So this is my overall understanding of how research should be pitched in the field.
Sir, are there any ongoing researches? Like, what is the current status of research in both these aspects? One is the hybrid that you were talking about, and one is the research which retains the authenticity of the concepts.
No, at the beginning, there were a lot of challenges, regulatory challenges, no framework for Ayurveda people to do any research. There were questions regarding clinical trials, whether Ayurveda should even be tried because of ethical issues from a modern point of view. When modern medicine is trying on HCQS, I was involved in some of these debates where they said HCQS is now the standard drug of choice for a clinical trial. So how can you replace it with some Ayurvedic herbs? So those kind of issues were there. Then
Mm,
there was also when it comes to preclinical research, since it's a virus, studying viruses in labs is quite challenging because
mm,
viruses are more dangerous and you need
mm,
really
mm,
high, safety precautions
mm,
to be able to do studies related to viruses. So even in modern medicine, modern doctors, modern scientists have limited access to, virology labs in India. There are only few with all the
mm,
necessary equipment to deal with, especially virulent viruses like this. So in vitro, in
mm,
vivo studies are also very challenging.
mm,
Uh, but the Ministry of Ayush established this, especially this task force basically was for research
mm,
because it was not for, a clinical, practical level response. That task force itself is called as interdisciplinary R&D Ayush Task Force for COVID-19. So a group of scientists and Ayurveda experts came together, and there were a lot of deliberations on what kind of researches can be done, preclinical, everything. And the Ministry of Ayush also issued a notification offering even funding for research related to COVID-19. And so that's the situation where the R&D task force also set up a committee to review the research proposals related to COVID-19 on a fast track basis. Now, if you look at the CTRI, there are more than 100 such studies going on. So research has happened. But there are challenges. So, if you want to look at preclinical studies, especially the hybrid kind of research, where we want to check whether a herb or drug has some activity against a virus, the easiest thing which we can do is what they call as in silico studies. That is, bioinformatics. You do computer modeling, docking studies, otherwise, which it is known as. So you identify chemicals in a group of plants, and then look at the protein, the receptor, the spike protein of the virus or the AC receptor, and see if through docking you see if there is an affinity. But this is only a very preliminary study. Something that is found positive here may not work clinically. So later you have to go for in vitro studies. And then finally we'll have to come to clinical trials. So here there are challenges. Most of the Ayurvedic studies got stuck at the level of in silico thing, and no in vitro studies have been done so far. There is a challenge. Clinical studies have been initiated.
So, what are some of the challenges in doing clinical trials in Ayurvedic medicine?
Yes, I mean, clinical trials, one is, uh, you need to have a good rationale to get a clinical trial in Ayurveda approved, because they say ethics committee, all these things. So since this is a new disease, generally speaking, you need to do some preclinical studies without which you cannot give a good backing to the drug being studied. This is when you're looking at it from a purely modern scientific way of research. So there are very, very few herbs on which there is already some data available on the basis of which we can really propose them for COVID-19. So some of the herbs or formulations which, according to Ayurvedic physicians, may actually be more effective, it may be very difficult to bring them into clinical trials, because the scientific committee, ethics committee will ask, where is the proof or evidence? And when they say proof or evidence, it's in modern terms. Have you done preclinical studies indicating that they have antiviral activity or that they have some immunomodulatory activity? Some of the plants in Ayurveda already have such some preliminary data preclinical. So only those are the ones that we are able to take up. And now some of the major clinical trials that have been initiated by the R&D, task force are have chosen herbs based on this approach. Some of the herbs which had some preclinical data have been chosen because they can be brought into clinical trials. So Guduchi, Yashti Madhu, Ashwagandha, and then one Ayush 64, which is a formulation developed by CCRAs for malaria. So these are the four things that came up. But if you go to an Ayurveda clinician and ask them, they would say many other formulations, which may be more effective. But because of this challenge of meeting the requirements, so this is one major challenge. We won't be able to study the drugs which we think may be most effective for COVID-19.
So, is there a way that we can overcome these challenges so that in without having to compromise on the authenticity of the concepts, can we in a way balance the both? Uh,
So, worldwide there is this new movement. In fact, this is also a matter of concern that in India we have not recognized.
mm,
Worldwide, there are new theories about mixed methods research, about whole systems, whole medical systems, whole systems research, how
mm,
traditional medicine should be studied using different methods. This idea itself has come from the West. In
mm,
India, we are still trying to follow the traditional
mm,
method of modern medical research. We have
mm,
very rigid methodology. So unless we become open to alternative methods of evaluation, because WHO long back mentioned that this black box design should be
mm,
considered for traditional medicine. And there should actually we have to create a situation where clinical trials should be allowed based on Ayurvedic rationale.
mm,
Because in Ayurveda also we say before we try something on a patient, there should be a good yukti behind it.
mm, mm,
Tasmanna bhishaja yuktam yukti bahena bheshajam dhimata kinchidadeyam jivida arogya kanchana. So if there is no yukti, we also don't allow any treatment to be given.
mm,
Yukti bahishkritam is not accepted. So if we can create a clinical trial protocol which is based on an Ayurvedic yukti, and some minimum bare considerations from modern science like efficacy, safety, make
mm,
sure that these herbs don't have pesticides or heavy
mm,
metals or some harmful substances,
mm,
and that their standards are maintained, that you can do
mm,
some HPTLC fingerprinting, show that the quality is good. So we have to
mm,
bring out such a framework for whole system research. Unless that comes, and some of us are now trying to put this across, and we
mm,
have together written an article, a commentary, which has almost got accepted, the Journal of Alternative and Complementary Medicine, where we are saying that we need a whole system research. This is the gap in the current research. We need to introduce this methodology also. Unfortunately, the Ministry of Ayush or the task force has not been able to create a space for whole system research. What we are
mm,
doing is a hybrid kind of research now.
mm,
But at least that has got started. So we should also be
mm,
constructive, because it's
mm,
it's also something good that Ayurveda at least is able to do something. But we need to
mm,
move forward.
mm. But the full potential need may not be
Yeah, may not
may
be
not come out.
discovered if it may not
Mm,
come out if we just follow the. While it is a good first step because it
mm,
brings Ayurveda into the visibility, even if
mm,
that is not there, then we won't be
mm,
doing anything at all.
mm,
So it's
mm,
good that at least this is a good step, and I also agree that we must have such hybrid research
mm,
approaches also. Only thing is that shouldn't be the only one and the
mm, mm,
most dominating way of research, because this
mm,
dialogue between medical systems are important. Unless we do this kind of hybrid research, our system will not be understood by others. We will also not be able to understand how other systems work. And
mm,
of course, there would be some areas of overlap where we can do work together. But the
mm,
core thing is that the core Ayurvedic approach shouldn't be lost in the process, and that should be our fundamental work. And these should
mm,
be additional things. Now,
mm,
this fundamental
mm.
thing is totally missing. That is the real challenge.
So, now that there are many challenges in doing the clinical part of it, so what can Ayurveda offer, or what is the scope of Ayurveda in prevention of COVID-19?
You mean in the prevention? Yeah.
Prevention.
Yeah, but just before that, I would like to also point out that one of the areas where we can do good research is in the clinical documentation, because
Mm,
that can become an equivalent for preclinical data. Like
mm,
now, since because in India, this is one peculiar thing, Ayurveda is already in the practice, which means that it's already in human use. Even for COVID, that situation has come. People are already being given
mm,
Ayurvedic
mm,
medicines at the
mm,
level of clinical practice, not as a
mm,
clinical trial. So if
mm,
we are very carefully documenting all this data
mm,
of the outcomes in clinical practice, that could
mm,
become a hypothesis for doing a good clinical trial.
mm,
We can so that I think
mm,
should be brought into the framework of research,
mm,
that all the clinicians should be asked to report if they are treating a COVID-19 patient. They should report it. to a central agency. In fact, there is a framework. WHO has a, in emergencies situations, how to do research, how to, even come up with practices which are not having a strong evidence base. There is a provision for that. Medical emergency, MURE framework is there. So, according to that framework, with the best evidence available, you can do interventions. But the thing is, you must report the outcomes. But Ayurvedic physicians today who are treating COVID-19 are not really reporting the outcomes.
So could you please elaborate on what is a black box design?
Yeah. So a black box design means, it's based on the idea you have the input, process, and output. So here we are just looking at the input and the output. We are not fully understanding what is the internal mechanism that happens. So especially when it comes to Ayurvedic systems, we may have multimodal treatments. So it's not possible always to understand which particular modality worked. So whether it was the first treatment that we gave, if we give 3 or 4 formulations with diet, with lifestyle modification, it becomes a confounding situation. We don't know which one worked, whether any one of them would have worked without the others. So that whole process of the interventions is a black box. We don't understand it. What we here basically understand is the outcomes. So we can say that that whole system worked or not. We won't be able to tell in terms of the efficacy of each and every component. So that is kept in the dark. So because it is kept in the dark or we don't fully understand it, so we are calling that as a black box design. So for whole systems trials, the black box design is suitable. Then we are not pressurizing the researchers to, show a cause and effect relationship for each and every component of the treatment. We look at it as a whole. We look at it as a whole intervention. So that's what a black box design is.